Hello and welcome to this PIR live event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research. My name is Ben Hobbs and I will be your host today. If you're joining us live, remember that you can ask questions at any point by using the Q&A located in the bottom center of your screen and typing your questions into the pop-up window. If you have a question in there that you are hoping to ask as well, you can prioritize that question by clicking the thumbs up icon that will just be below that person's question. And I will relay these to our host during the Q&A portion of the webinar. So without further ado, today's guest is Dr. Jennifer McKellar, Associate Professor in Faculty of Energy Systems and Nuclear Science at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. Thanks for joining us, Dr. McKellar. I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to all of you. So I'm going to talk about alternative energy sources, and I have a few slides to share here. That should be showing up. So I thought I'd start off just talking a little bit about sort of alternative energy sources in general, and then sort of one slide on solar energy and fuel cells, since I teach courses on those topics here at UOIT. And then I've got a little bit about my research area, which looks more at the environmental impacts of energy systems. So one of the biggest questions that we have is how we choose an energy source. And when we do that, it's important that we remember, well, in most cases, we don't really care what our energy source is. We don't really care where the energy comes from. What we're really interested in is the energy services that they provide. So we want heat in the winter. We want lights to turn on when we walk into a room. We need transportation to get us from home to school and back. And the energy that we choose to do that, in some ways it doesn't really matter. In other ways, it has a big impact on our environment, our finances, so how much money we have to spend, and in some cases on society in general. So the choice of which energy we choose to provide those services for us, it can be a complicated question. One of the good things that we have in our favor is that we have a lot of options to choose from. So in the past, we've used a lot of fossil fuels, so things like natural gas, coal, oil. We can convert those fuels into other fuels, so we can take oil and make it into gasoline, and we can use that to run our cars. We've often burned coal to produce electricity, and that's relatively inexpensive, but it's got a lot of greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. We also have sort of unconventional fuels and different unconventional uses for some of the fuels that we have. So for example, the oil sands in Alberta, that's really an unconventional source of oil. It's different from the traditional type of oil where you just drill a well and oil comes out. With the oil sands, we have to put a little bit more effort into it. We can also use fuels in ways that are a little bit different. So for example, natural gas, we often use that to heat our homes, but we could also use it to run a vehicle, for example. Hydroelectric power, we've used that for a long time as well. If anyone's had the opportunity to see Niagara Falls, I guess you've probably all seen pictures of it, but if you've seen it in person, it's quite a sight. And it's been running for a long time. We've got a lot of small hydropower as well, so just making use of smaller rivers, for example. And then there's people looking at new ways to use hydroelectric power. So using tidal energy. As the tide comes in, we can make use of some of the energy. People are working on extracting energy from waves. So as the waves go up and down, we can try and capture some of that energy. And currents. So the big flows in the ocean that get water from South America up to Europe, we can try and capture some of that energy as well. Solar energy, which I'm going to talk about a little bit on the next slide. Wind is a big one. Biofuels. So in the past, biofuels meant using burning wood to keep ourselves warm. Now biofuels might mean turning corn into ethanol and using that to run our vehicles. And then the last one I have on the list here is hydrogen, which has also been talked about for a long time. It's still not widely used, but it also has a lot of potential. So we have all of these different energy sources that are available to us and we could use if we wanted to. So just as I said, a little bit about solar energy and fuel cells, since I teach courses on these topics. So up on the, oops, I'll probably point to it here. This is probably the type of picture that people are most familiar with when they think about solar energy, right? So these are PV panels, photovoltaic panels. And so they take electricity, sorry, they take sunlight and they convert that solar energy directly into electricity. So that's a pretty environmentally friendly technology. We don't have any emissions from the panels themselves. They last quite a while. The disadvantage, of course, is that they really only produce when the sun is out. They're not going to produce power for you overnight. And so solar PV panels really need to be combined with the energy storage system. So you need a battery, for example, to really make that system work well. One of the oldest ways that we've used energy is just passive solar energy. So this picture of this house, it's got the PV panels on the roof, but it's also got these windows up at the top here and over the front door, sort of. So you can design your house to use solar energy passively. You can design it so that the sun comes in the winter, warms up the inside of the house, but you can also have awnings or overhangs to keep the sun out in the summer when you want it to be cooler in the house. So that's a way to make use of the solar energy that's available to us without even having to have some sort of technology or electricity or anything else involved. Down the bottom here, this is a newer type of solar energy called concentrating solar. There's a few different types. This particular type is called a power tower. It's a little bit hard to see what's going on in this picture. Down along the ground here, there's arrays of mirrors. And so the sunlight comes in, it hits a mirror, and it's directed onto the top of this tower. And it's going to heat up a fluid in the top of this tower that's going to produce steam, and then we can use that steam to turn a turbine and generate electricity. So this type of plant works well where you get a lot of sunlight, a lot of direct sunlight. So you can see it looks like it's in a bit of a desert region. That's sort of where that technology works best. Over on the right here, I've got sort of a basic schematic of a fuel cell. So this type of technology it's a little bit less well known than solar energy. Now when you're sort of just driving around in a city, or if you're going through a rural area, you often see solar panels on rooftops. Don't see fuel cells as much, but it is another option that we have available to us. So what I've got drawn here is sort of a traditional type of hydrogen oxygen fuel cell. So it takes hydrogen in, it's going to undergo a chemical reaction. Electrons are going to come off and give us our electricity. They're going to come around here. And then on the far side here, we have oxygen being injected. The oxygen will react with protons from the hydrogen and produce water. So it's a clean technology in that we insert hydrogen and oxygen and we get water out. So there's no carbon dioxide, for example, coming off a fuel cell. One of the questions associated with fuel cells, though, is where this hydrogen comes from. And that's a key question, because depending on where the hydrogen comes from, we may have bigger environmental impacts than we think we might. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple of slides here. So when it comes to choosing an energy source, what's important to remember is that none of them are perfect. All of them have some pros and cons. And there's a lot of different things we need to consider when we try to make that decision. So we need to consider the environmental impacts, so emissions to air, land use, water use. The solar panels don't have any emissions from the solar panels themselves, but they may cover a lot of land, for example. We need to consider social factors. So energy can't be too expensive. We don't want anyone to not have lights or heating in the winters. We need to make sure it's affordable. It's also sometimes hard to figure out where to put plants, right? Not a lot of people are happy living next to a power plant. Some people are. But it's a complicated question of where to actually build a new power plant. We need to consider economic factors. So again, how expensive is it? We also need to consider what are called externalities. So these are things that we don't usually think about them as having a cost associated with them, but it's a usually negative impact that does actually have some cost when you really think about it. So for example, when we burn gasoline in our vehicles, we produce a lot of carbon dioxide, but we also produce some other pollutants that can cause health impacts. And so if people are getting sick, that's obviously a negative impact, and there are some financial costs associated with that. So even though a fuel may seem cheap, if you just wanted to, if you could go to the store and buy it, it might be cheap to pay for, but there might be other environmental and health impacts associated with them that we really want to consider when we're doing a big picture analysis. We also need to consider technical factors. So not all types of energy are available everywhere. So I said those concentrating solar plants, they're good where we have a lot of direct sunlight. So in desert regions, for example. In Canada, not as useful. There's at least one plant that I know about in Canada, but just because of where we are geographically, the solar resource isn't very well suited to that type of plant. So my research looks at a systems level approach to energy systems analysis. So it asks the question of sort of going back to the fuel cells, where does the hydrogen come from? So the example I have here is a vehicle. So a conventional car emits GHGs, or greenhouse gases, from burning gasoline. But does it matter where that gasoline came from? And then what would happen if it were an electric car or a hydrogen-fueled car? So if it were an electric car, we would want to know whether that electricity was produced from coal or from wind, for example. So my research uses what's called life cycle assessment. So this is a method for evaluating environmental impacts. You may have heard the term carbon footprint. So life cycle assessment is essentially the same as carbon footprint. It's sometimes called cradle to grave or well to wheel type analyses. And what it does is, rather than just looking at the emissions that result when we actually drive our car, so what's coming out of the muffler, it goes all the way along the chain to see where that gasoline came from. Or if it's an electric vehicle, it goes all the way along the chain to see how that electricity was generated. And if it was generated from coal, for example, where did we mine that coal? And it adds up all the emissions along that whole chain until we get to the vehicle. So here, for a gasoline-powered vehicle, we would go all the way back to where that oil came out of the ground, how it was transported to a refinery. After it was turned into gasoline, how did it get to the gas station? And then what happens when we actually burn the gasoline? Okay. For this type of analysis, all of our emissions are reported in terms of what's called a functional unit. So for vehicles, it's a kilometer driven. So we look at the greenhouse gas emissions per kilometer that we drive. And that's important because it reminds us that it's the function of our energy that's important. We don't really care so much where the energy came from, right? We care about the service that it's providing to us. So just to get near the end here, but I have this graph. So this is sort of developed using a model that's available online. And what it's showing is greenhouse gas emissions from different types of vehicles. So this tall column here, this is a gasoline-fueled vehicle in Ontario. So you can see the total emissions of greenhouse gases are larger than we get from the other bars. And a big chunk of them are from actually driving the car. So this is carbon dioxide other greenhouse gases that are released when we actually get in the car and burn the gasoline to get from A to B. The other three bars are the emissions from electric vehicles driven in Quebec, Ontario, Saskatchewan. So in these bars, you can see there's no light green, so there's no emission from the vehicle itself because it's just running on electricity. But we do have emissions associated with producing the electricity. And they vary quite a bit depending on which province you're in. So in Quebec, where they have a lot of hydropower, have very low emissions, whereas in Saskatchewan, where you have more coal being burned, you have much higher emissions. So depending on where you are in Canada, your choice of energy is going to vary depending on the emissions you want to release, the amount of money you want to pay, and the type of energy that you have available. So I think maybe I'll stop there and ask if there's any questions.
Well, thank you. Just before we begin the Q&A, I would like to remind those classrooms joining us live today to direct their questions to the Q&A, which you can find in the bottom center of your screen. So our first question today comes from Mr. McCabe's class, and they're wondering, how can we use alternative energy sources in our homes?
Right, so how can we use alternative energy sources in our homes? So solar is a good example, right? So you can do sort of simple things like keeping the blinds open in the winter to let the sun in and have it heat up the house during the day. So then you don't need to run your furnace as much. And at the same time, keeping the blinds closed in winter in summer, keeps out the sun and means you need less air conditioning. You could put photovoltaic panels on the roof. You could also use the sun for hot water heating. So I didn't have a picture of this one, but you put a panel on the roof, for example. It looks kind of like a PV panel, but it's, rather than generating electricity, it's got fluid in it, and it absorbs the heat from the sun, and then it takes that down to the basement and uses that to heat up your hot water.
Well, thank you. Those are certainly some interesting things that we can do. Our next question comes from Parker in Miss Vicar's classroom, and he's wondering, how long does it take for a solar panel to charge up?
So a solar panel doesn't really need to charge. It's as soon as the sun hits it, a photovoltaic panel will start to generate electricity. So one of the challenges with a photovoltaic panel is that it only generates electricity when the sun is on it, right? So while you don't have to charge the panel, you may want to use the panel to charge a battery so you can use that energy later.
Interesting. So I guess it depends then on the size of the battery for how long it would take to charge.
Yeah, yeah.
So our next question is actually coming from Calgary. And Jack and Noah are wondering if you could tell them about some different types of nuclear power.
Okay, so nuclear is not my area of expertise, but in Canada, we have what are called can-do plants. So that's, they are pressurized heavy water reactors. Different types of plants do exist, and it varies a little bit depending on where you are around the world. One of the things that is receiving some attention now is people are working on what's called small modular reactors. So all the reactors that we have, well, most of the reactors that we have right now are very big, and they're producing sort of gigawatts of energy. But people are working on smaller reactors that produce more on sort of a megawatt scale. So I'm not sure, more like, so rather than a gigawatt scale, which would provide power to a big chunk of a province, for example, you might have a small modular reactor which produces power for a community. So just sort of the houses or businesses that are nearby.
Okay, so that's interesting. Our next question comes from Mr. MacArthur's class, and he's wondering, is nuclear energy technically a reusable energy source?
So is nuclear energy technically renewable? Technically, no. So it is using uranium, and uranium is not renewable. It's something that has to be mined out of the ground. Sometimes it kind of gets lumped into that category sometimes, partly because the emissions are relatively low. Partly because in a CANDU reactor, for example, we use actually relatively little of the energy that's in the uranium in the plant before we take that particular fuel rod out. So there's still some energy left that if we wanted to, we could go back in and try to get out.
So what are some ways that we could limit our sort of emission usage on a daily basis? Something that an average person could do.
So there's lots of things. A lot of times people think of climate change as a big global problem that they can't help with. But if everybody did a little bit, we could make a difference. So it can be simple things, turning the lights off when you leave a room. It sounds super easy, and it is super easy, but it can make a big difference. If you still have incandescent light bulbs, if you change those to LED, for example, that reduces a lot of energy. If you can walk to school rather than driving or getting a ride, that saves energy. If you have air conditioning, turning it up a little bit so you're not keeping your house as cold as you might otherwise, that can save energy. So every time you save a little bit, it makes a difference in the long run.
I imagine that certainly when we look at that in the population scale. So our next question today is coming from Emily, and she's wondering, could water be used as a source of energy for a boat?
Could water be used? I'm not sure. That doesn't mean it's not. Maybe that's something that needs to be invented. So most of the hydro sources that we have, the energy has to be generated in one place. So whatever is extracting the energy from the water is stationary. And I mean, you want your boat to move, so that wouldn't help so much. And you tend to need a lot of water to get hydropower, right? So that's why you put it on a waterfall, for example, or a fast-moving river, because you need a lot of water. So nothing's springing to mind, but that's not to say it's impossible.
We were working towards something like that.
Sure.
So our next question is referring to the graph that you brought up, the different vehicles in different provinces. And Mr. Wilson's classroom, number one, wondering why Saskatchewan is so much higher than the others, and should they look at sources of energy such as wind power and hydro, or wind power and solar as alternatives to coal to sort of reduce that?
Right. So maybe if I just go back to it, I think that should work. So yeah, so this blue part is really the difference between the different provinces for electric vehicles, right? And that's fuel production. So for electric vehicles, that's the electricity generation piece. And so in Quebec, their electricity generation relies heavily on hydropower. And so they have very few greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. Whereas in Saskatchewan, more heavily reliant on fossil fuels, and so they have bigger emissions of greenhouse gas emissions associated with their electricity. So yeah, if you could produce more of the electricity in Saskatchewan from something like wind or solar, you could definitely drop this blue part down and be more in line with some of the other provinces. Ontario is a little bit mixed, right? It's got a lot of nuclear, which is low emitting, a lot of hydro, and then it does have some fossil fuels though. So that's why we're bigger than Quebec there.
And maybe just a follow-up on that question, why is it that when we look at Saskatchewan, they aren't using the same amount of renewables that we see in Ontario?
So sometimes it just depends on what you have, right? So Ontario doesn't have lots of coal, so we didn't really have the option of mining it and burning it ourselves. We'd have to buy it from Saskatchewan. Whereas we have a lot of hydro, for example. We have Niagara Falls, so that was an obvious choice for us. In Saskatchewan, they have a lot of coal, and one of the pieces of energy is its price, right? And so if you have a lot of coal, that tends to make coal inexpensive. And if you want, people generally like things to be inexpensive, so you'd use the coal if you had it. If Saskatchewan wanted to shift to wind and solar, that's going to be more expensive. It's also, it only works when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, right? So you could definitely install a lot of wind and solar in Saskatchewan, but you'd also need a lot of storage to go with it, which again, expensive. And I mean, realistically, you'd probably keep some other fuel as to fill in the gaps, right? You're not going to be able to produce enough with your wind and solar.
Mm-hmm. So it's the dollar value again.
Yeah.
So our next question comes from Evelyn, and she is in grade 6 in Mr. Babcock's class, and she's wondering, is it possible to make a solar panel from materials available in your home?
A PV panel, no, but a solar thermal system, you could make a simple solar thermal system to heat hot water. Yeah.
And then you could use that to generate electricity?
No, you could get it to produce hot water, but to produce electricity from heat, you need a lot of heat. And so you wouldn't really be able to do that at home, but you could get warm water from it.
Certainly a start there.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from Ms. Quinlan's classroom, and they're wondering what percentage of Canadian homes are using alternative energy sources?
I don't have a number, but it's not a lot. In Ontario, we had what was called the feed-in tariff program, where if people put solar panels on their roof, for example, the government promised to buy that energy that they generated at a fairly high price. So a lot of people now have solar panels on their roofs, and that's not, I mean, that's a lot of people outside of Ontario as well are doing that. A lot of people have, rather than using a furnace, they use heat from the ground, so geothermal. That's not, I think I said a lot of people, probably not a lot of people in terms of the grand scheme of things, but some people are. So it's something still relatively few, I guess, when you look at all the people, but it is happening.
Now, do you know if we're trending sort of upwards to more alternative energy, or are we headed in the wrong direction in that case?
So again, I don't really have the numbers, but my sense would be that we are generally trending towards more integration of renewable energies if we look at the grand scheme of things and how much more solar we have coming online in wind turbines.
So I heard you mention before that some energy sources were more efficient than others. I think you mentioned how we put solar panels in those areas to get more sunlight, obviously, because we get more energy per solar panel there. Do you know which the most efficient alternative energy sources are?
The most efficient alternative energy sources. That's a good question. They all tend to be fairly low, actually. We would like to be able to find a highly efficient energy source. Even conventional energy sources are not especially efficient. A traditional coal-fired plant, for example, is maybe in the 30% range. A PV panel might be more, let's see, a little bit a while since I looked at the numbers, maybe more like 20% max. So, but a new natural gas combined cycle plant might be up around 60%. And that's sort of I think that's sort of the best efficiency that we've seen. So nothing is really super high anyway.
So we're not quite where we'd love to be for that efficiency level yet.
Yeah. I mean, there's certain sort of technical limits that sort of can't be overcome as well.
Mm-hmm. And our next question comes from Mr. Lake's classroom, and they're wondering, what is the environmental impact of building these solar panels or building these electric cars?
Right. So we can't, when we look at the life cycle of a energy system, we can't forget the energy that goes into actually manufacturing the solar panels or the electric vehicles. And so in those slides, let me just go back one more time. The dark green part at the top, that's the manufacturing of the vehicle and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the materials that go into the vehicles. So you can see the electric vehicles are actually a little bit more greenhouse gas intensive than a conventional vehicle when it comes to actually manufacturing them. And then we also need to worry about what happens at their end of life, right? So we've got all these solar panels, we need to make sure that they're recycled safely, that anything that can't be recycled is disposed of safely. And it's not only greenhouse gases, right? They have toxic materials or toxic metals in them. We need to make sure that those are all managed appropriately.
So if you had to pick one alternative energy source that Ontario should really focus on for improving in the future, what do you think that would be?
So it's tricky. My personal opinion, I guess, if we were going to focus on one, solar is probably a good bet, because I would focus sort of on putting it on buildings or land that's not really useful for anything else. So land that used to be an industrial site, for example, that we can't really build anything else on, or it's never really going to be remediated to green space again, something like that.
Okay, that's certainly interesting. We're just running out of time here, but before we end, I was hoping to have you speak a little bit about sort of your career path, how you ended up where you are today, and maybe some advice for students who are considering a similar field.
Sure. So I did my, after high school, I went to chemical engineering and did my bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. We had the program I was in had an environmental option. So I was chemical engineering in the environmental option. I did my master's in chemical engineering. Then I worked in environmental consulting for just over a year, looking at emissions to air. And then I went back to do a PhD in civil engineering with an environmental option again. So my path is all engineering. That's definitely an option for someone interested in working in the energy sector. Here at UOIT, we have nuclear engineering bachelor's degree. We also have programs in mechanical engineering, for example. But the energy sector is quite broad, and we need lots of people looking at it from lots of different angles. So if you're interested in PIR science, there's lots of people doing research in new materials for energy systems, in fuel cells. If you're interested in more the social side of things, that's definitely a big side of the energy sector. We're actually starting a new program, a Bachelor of Technology in Sustainable Energy Systems, which is broader than an engineering degree, so you get a little bit more of the social side, a little bit more of the business side. If you wanted to go straight business, lots of opportunities for energy businesses as well. So it's a sector that's really broad, and there's a lot of room for people to come in and contribute.
If you could give your 14-year-old yourself a piece of advice, what would it be?
Sorry, to my 14-year-old self?
Yeah.
Maybe sort of pay attention to what's going on in the world around you. So, and the news can be a little bit boring, but it's interesting to know what's going on in the world. A lot of times there's stories about new developments in the news. There's stories about people who need help. So developing energy systems for developing countries, for example, is a great opportunity to help people around the world who don't have. In Canada, we have so many energy sources to choose from. We're actually really well off compared to a lot of places that don't have that option or don't have the money to develop the resources that they have. So yeah, I would say pay attention to the world around you, and energy will pop up everywhere, and you can decide where you want to make a contribution.
Well, thank you so much for everything. That's all the time we have today. That was great hearing about some of the alternative energy sources we have available to us. So next week on PIR Live Event, we are hosting a series of 5 English webinars and 2 French webinars for a Computer Science Education Week. More information about these webinars and other PIR educational programs available at pirweb.org. Thanks for tuning in and have a wonderful day.